Bitch told you to come on. Come on. I'm gonna open the phone is powered on, gang.
But that phone ain't reverse. Remember when y'all phone reverse? When I'll be telling you this number right, and share your location to this number. Each thing.
Come on, man. What the f, gang? I don't. What the f, gang?
Put the number in.
Listen, gang. Your heart racing before mine, gang. I'm over, gang.
Put the number in.
I'm in traffic.
Glock 33, 357. My shit shoot like Scotty. Big Glock 34. D slam like Giannis. He try and catch a body.
This is Stefan Marmont, known online as HB, a young rapper from St. Louis whose death did not bring closure, but instead pulled his family into another act of violence when attackers opened fire from within the crowd at his funeral. In the early hours of January 5, 2026, just after 2:27 a.m., gunfire broke out on the 2000 block of Swisser Avenue in Jennings, Missouri. When police arrived, Stefan had been shot. He was pronounced dead at the scene on his 19th birthday. But the horrors did not end there. On the afternoon of January 28, 2026, as his family gathered at Cotton Branch Mortuary in Ferguson, Missouri, near North Florissant Road to mourn him, violence followed them again. What was meant to be a moment of grief and remembrance turned into panic when shots rang out during his funeral service, hitting over 6 of Stefan's family. But for us to understand how everything ended in 2 deadly shootings, we have to go back to the very beginning. This is the life and death of Stefan Marmont.
Glock 33, 357. My shit shoot like Scotty. Big Glock 34. D slam like Giannis. He try and catch a body.
It's a movie, man. This shit a movie. We the directors. The cameraman never dies. I know y'all heard that.
Stefan Marmont was born on January 5, 2007, a birth date that will not just be marked by joy, but also pain. But long before that pain, Stefan was already known in his part of St. Louis. To the family, he was Stefan. To the people who followed his music and watched his videos online, he was HB. He wasn't famous in the way national artists are famous, but in Moline Acres and nearby neighborhoods, his name and face were familiar. People recognized his voice, his slang, and the streets that appeared behind him in videos. And in places like that, recognition can feel like belonging. Stefan grew up in an environment where people learned early how to read a room and watch who was around them. Moline Acres wasn't a place where kids were sheltered from reality. It was a neighborhood that showed up often in vlogs and interviews, where people spoke openly about tension between areas and how quickly things could shift. Stefan talked about that world without dramatizing it. In clips that circulated online, he described daily life as something you had to stay alert for, not something you could move through casually. That wasn't bravado, it was how he understood his surroundings. But what made Stefan stand out wasn't just where he was from, it was how visible he chose to be. As HB, he leaned into music as a way to express himself and his environment. He appeared in interviews, walked through his neighborhood on camera, and spoke freely about where he came from. Those videos weren't scripted. They showed him talking with friends, answering questions, and explaining local slang and dynamics. He didn't pretend the area was peaceful, but he also didn't frame it as constant chaos. It was just life as he knew it, and for a teenager, that openness felt natural. But openness has consequences. As Stefan's videos continued to circulate, his name began reaching far beyond the people who actually knew him. Online attention grew quickly, views climbed, comments multiplied, and strangers began forming opinions about who he was, what he represented, and where he came from. Support poured in alongside criticism, rumors, and speculation from people who had never crossed his path. But Stefan didn't disappear. He didn't retreat from the spotlight that was forming around him, and that visibility followed him straight into a moment that would change everything. The attention around Stefan wasn't harmless. It changed how people saw him offline, not just online. Every post and every appearance added to a version of him that kept growing, whether he agreed with it or not. All of it led to a single day, one that should have been a celebration. Stefan turned a year older, his birthday. On January 5, 2026, everything came crashing down. Stefan Marmont had just turned 19. Birthdays are usually markers of forward motion, another year passed, another year waiting ahead. But in the early hours of that morning, just after 2:27 a.m., gunfire broke out on the 2000 block of Swisser Avenue in Jennings, Missouri. When police arrived, Stefan had been shot. He never left the scene. Investigators immediately treated the incident as a homicide. Officers secured the area, began canvassing for witnesses, and collected evidence from the street. But early on, authorities made one thing clear: they did not yet know who was responsible or what led up to the shooting. There was no suspect named, no arrests announced, no motive released. Police stated that the investigation was ongoing and that they were still working to determine the circumstances surrounding what happened on Swisser Avenue that night. They did not describe the shooting as random, but they also did not confirm that it was targeted. At that stage, too many pieces were missing. And that silence mattered. In the hours after Stefan's death, investigators continued working the scene and following leads, but publicly, very little information was released. There were no updates explaining why it happened or who might be responsible, and in the absence of answers, people began filling in the gaps themselves. Among those who knew Stefan, there was a shared belief that the shooting wasn't random. Some quietly raised the possibility of a backdoor situation, meaning someone Stefan trusted may have played a role. That belief didn't come from police statements or official reports. It came from shock, from confusion, and from trying to understand how a night that started as a birthday could end in gunfire. At the same time, Stefan's family was trying to grieve in real life while the internet kept moving without a pause. Fake social media accounts appeared using Stefan's name and photos. Rumors spread quickly, often repeating the same unverified claims over and over. Comment sections turned hostile. People who had never met Stefan spoke with certainty about his life, his relationships, and his death. What started as speculation slowly turned into noise that refused to quiet down. Eventually, that noise reached Stefan's mother. She went public not to argue or defend herself, but to ask people to stop. She reminded everyone that the online back and forth wasn't harmless, it wasn't entertainment. It was affecting a family that was already trying to process an unbearable loss. Her message wasn't dramatic or emotional, it was exhausted, and it made one thing clear: Stefan's death had created more than grief. It had created disorder around the people who loved him most. As days turned into weeks, the situation didn't settle. The funeral, which was meant to be a moment of closure, was delayed due to severe weather. The service had to be pushed back, extending the waiting period for Stefan's family and friends. That delay mattered. It gave emotions more time to build. It allowed rumors to continue spreading, and it kept unanswered questions hanging in the air. By the time the service was rescheduled, the atmosphere surrounding Stefan's death was already tense.
Within the last 10 minutes, St. Louis County Police providing an update on a shooting in Jennings. Police telling us they are investigating a homicide after a man was killed after getting shot in Jennings. This happened on Switzer Avenue, happened around 2:30 this morning. We will continue to determine just how this happened, and we will also update you when we get more information on our news app.
On January 28, 2026, hundreds of people gathered at Cotton Branch Mortuary in Ferguson, Missouri, near North Florissant Road, to mourn him. Violence followed them again.
Oh, I can't get out. I don't know. Closest hospital
The service was meant to honor Stefan's life and finally give his family a quiet space to grieve. For weeks, everything surrounding his death had felt unstable and unresolved, and this was supposed to be the moment where time slowed down. For many in attendance, it was the first chance they had to stand still and process the loss together. But that sense of calm didn't last, and things are about to escalate in a way no one expected. About an hour into the service, the atmosphere inside the funeral home shifted suddenly. What began as confusion quickly turned into fear as gunshots rang out. The shots were not confined to one area. They came from outside the building and from within it, leaving people unsure of where the danger was coming from or how to escape it safely. Within seconds, the service collapsed into chaos. People began running in different directions, trying to shield family members and friends as they moved. Chairs were knocked over as mourners rushed toward exits. Glass shattered inside the building. Outside, bullets struck several vehicles in the parking lot as people attempted to flee. What was supposed to be a controlled and private moment of mourning turned into panic almost instantly. And as the confusion spread, calls for help followed. Multiple people dialed 911 within moments of the shots being fired. When officers arrived just minutes later, they were met with a scene police would later describe as overwhelming. People were still running, others were hiding. Families had been separated in the rush. Officers worked to secure the area and regain control as emergency responders moved in to assist the injured. Once the scene was stabilized, the full scope of what had happened became clearer. 6 people had been injured during the incident. 3 suffered gunshot wounds, though authorities later confirmed those injuries were not life-threatening. The remaining 3 were hurt while trying to escape, including individuals struck by flying glass and one person who was hit by a vehicle during the panic in the parking lot. Everyone survived, but the damage had already been done. As investigators began documenting the scene, the scale of the violence became even more apparent. Evidence markers were placed throughout the property, eventually totaling more than 30. Shell casings and bullet fragments traced paths through the funeral home and surrounding area. Several cars belonging to mourners were visibly damaged. The space that was meant to bring closure now looked like the aftermath of another violent crime scene. But almost immediately, confusion spilled beyond the scene itself. Online, rumors began spreading that someone had walked into the funeral and intentionally opened fire on mourners. Those claims gained traction quickly, but they did not reflect what investigators were finding. Family members and people who were present moved quickly to correct the narrative, stressing that no one deliberately entered the service with the intent to attack attendees. Police later confirmed that gunfire occurred both inside and outside the building, but they did not support claims of a single shooter walking in and targeting the service. Witnesses were interviewed on scene and multiple individuals were detained for questioning as investigators worked to piece together how the violence unfolded. At that time, no arrests or charges were publicly announced. And once again, Stefan's name became tied to violence. What made the shooting so disturbing wasn't only that people were hurt, it was where it happened. A funeral is meant to be a pause, a moment where everything else stops. When violence breaks into that space, it leaves people questioning whether there is anywhere left where conflict truly ends. Community members expressed disbelief in the hours that followed, not through speeches or slogans, but through a shared sense of exhaustion. Law enforcement officials acknowledged that there had been ongoing efforts between police and community groups to reduce violence in the area, and that the funeral shooting represented a serious setback. Even after the crowd dispersed, the confusion did not fade. But as investigators worked through the chaos, new details slowly began to surface. In the days following the January 28, 2026 funeral shooting at Cotton Branch Mortuary, detectives reviewed surveillance footage, interviewed witnesses, and compared conflicting accounts from inside and outside the building. Early on, the scene was difficult to reconstruct. Gunfire had erupted in multiple directions, people fled at once, and panic distorted what many remembered seeing. Then, investigators reached a critical breakthrough. As of now, the investigation into the funeral home shooting remains ongoing. D'Angelo Taylor is still in custody at the St. Louis County Jail, held on a $750,000 cash-only bond, facing charges of armed criminal action, unlawful use of a weapon, and unlawful possession of an illegal weapon related specifically to the January 28, 2026 shooting at Cotton Branch Mortuary. Authorities have not announced any additional arrests, and no further charges have been publicly filed as of this time. Importantly, police have not released an official motive for the shooting. Investigators have confirmed the arrest and recovery of a modified firearm, but they have not stated whether the incident was planned, retaliatory, or connected to any specific individual inside the funeral home. Any broader conclusions remain under review.
All right, Chief, what happened today?
All right, so approximately 11:58 this morning, we received calls for shots fired at the Cotton Branch funeral home here on South Florissant Road. Within a couple of minutes, less than 2 minutes, we had the first officer arrived on the scene. He immediately called out for an officer in need of aid. Complete chaos. We had hundreds of individuals attending this funeral, numerous individuals obviously running in different directions. We began putting out descriptions of individuals, getting witnesses' statement, and based off of that, we were able to stop a couple people, persons of interest that was possibly involved with this. We also recovered a couple guns. This is still early on in the investigation. We're still looking into things. However, it was 6 people that was injured total. 3 were gunshot wound victims, and the other individuals were just injured just due to chaos.
Let's talk about how this is a tragedy when someone else is visiting the funeral as well.
Anytime you have a shooting, it's a tragedy in our community, of course, but it's kind of unfortunate, because you have loved ones that come to a funeral to grieve, a member of their family, and unfortunately, subjected to this type of chaos.
Talk to us about where the gunshots were at.
So again, it's still early on in the investigation, but preliminary information showed that some of the gunshots came from outside, and there may also be gunshots that were carried inside the funeral home.
Can you tell us whether or not there's a feud between individuals? Is this retaliation? Anything that you could say about that?
Yeah, again, we don't know. It's still early on. I know this sounds, like I said, we're just early on in the investigation.
Any suspects apprehended?
We have several people of interest apprehended at this particular time.
Now, we counted at least 31 markers outside. How many gunshots do you think?
Again, you're asking questions that's very preliminary. We're still counting those things. We're still interviewing witnesses. Again, we're still trying to interview individuals that we have in custody. So everything right now is very preliminary. What I'm doing this afternoon is just giving you the facts of what we know as of right now.
Do we know the conditions of the victims?
Yeah, those gunshot victims that she was saying, what's their condition?
Non-life-threatening injuries.
So the gunshots were coming from outside and inside?
We're still looking into that, but preliminary information saying that both could have happened.
But within the community, a different understanding has taken shape. Many people believe the shooting was not random. The prevailing belief is that the violence stemmed from ongoing neighborhood tensions and unresolved conflicts tied to Stefan's death, rather than the funeral itself being the original target. In this view, the gathering brought together people connected to the same environment, and long-standing issues followed them there. That belief has not been confirmed by police. However, it explains why so many residents described the shooting as an extension of existing disputes rather than a spontaneous act against mourners. It also explains why so many people felt fear spread so quickly afterwards, because to many the violence felt familiar, not sudden. And that distinction matters, because if the shooting was rooted in unresolved conflict, then the funeral was not the cause. It was simply the moment when everything collided in public. And until investigators fully clarify how and why the gunfire started, that uncertainty continues to hang over Stefan's name, his family, and the community he left behind. For now, the case remains open. Still, the arrest did not undo what had already happened. Stefan Marmont had been killed on his birthday earlier in January, with no suspect publicly named in his death. Just weeks later, the service meant to honor his life became the scene of another shooting, leaving 6 people injured. 2 separate acts of violence were now connected by one name, one loss, and a community struggling to regain its footing. And for Stefan's family, grief did not move in a straight line. Each development reopened pain that had barely begun to settle. First came the shock of losing him, then came the violence at the funeral, and even with an arrest made on January 30th, the weight of everything that had happened remained heavy. Because Stefan was supposed to be remembered in peace. Instead, his absence became tied to another violent moment, one that showed how quickly grief can be compounded and how difficult closure becomes when loss is followed by more chaos. What do you think about it? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you found this story intriguing, please like, share, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one.